The February Revolution of 1917, when the Tsar fell. 11 labs friendly pacing with clear pauses. February 1917. The Russian Empire, a giant that still looked enormous on the map, was standing on legs that were already shaking. From Europe to the Pacific, Russia stretched across continents. But inside the country, the foundations were cracking. This is the story of how a centuries-old autocracy collapsed in a matter of days. Not because an enemy army invaded, but because ordinary people and the soldiers sworn to defend the regime stopped obeying. Part 1. An Empire at War. By early 1917, Russia was deep in the First World War. The conflict had dragged on for more than 2 years, and the cost was brutal. Millions of soldiers were dead or wounded. Families received telegrams that changed their lives forever. Trains filled with the injured moved through the cities, reminding everyone that the war was not far away. It was here. And as the war continued, it did not only kill at the front, it broke the economy at home. Food became scarce, prices rose, wages failed to keep up. Winter cut through coats and walls, while coal supplies ran thin. In the major cities, especially Petrograd, long lines for bread became normal. People waited for hours in freezing wind, and sometimes, when they finally reached the counter, the doors shut. No more bread. Hunger was only part of it. The deeper feeling was humiliation. And the same question kept returning. Why are we living like this? Meanwhile, the palace still glowed with electric light. The elite still hosted dinners, and inside the court, politics turned into rumor, intrigue, and paralysis. Faith in the Tsar had been weakening for years. After the revolution of 1905, Russia gained reforms and a parliament, the Duma. But real power still rested with the monarch, and in a crisis, half measures were not enough. In 1915, Tsar Nicholas II made a fateful choice. He went to army headquarters and took personal command of the war effort. It sounded bold, but it was a strategic disaster. From that moment on, every military setback became the Tsar's setback. Back in the capital, day-to-day government fell to Empress Alexandra, and to a controversial figure whose name became shorthand for scandal, Grigory Rasputin. Stories of Rasputin's influence spread everywhere. True or not, it hardly mattered anymore. What mattered was this: people believed the court was corrupted and out of touch, and respect, once lost, is almost impossible to recover. An empire losing a war, a capital running out of bread, a monarchy running out of credibility. Together, it formed a mixture that could ignite from a single spark. Part 2. Petrograd, a city of ice and bread lines. Petrograd, Russia's capital at the time, a huge industrial city, packed with workers, and a place where tension had been building for months. Factories producing weapons and ammunition ran at full speed, but workers were exhausted, 10, 12 hours a day, in bitter cold, with too little food. All it needed was a spark, and that spark arrived in late February. On February 23rd by the old Russian calendar, March 8th by the modern calendar, International Women's Day brought crowds into the streets. Women marched for bread, They marched against the war. They marched for a life that felt human again. At first, even many revolutionary activists were surprised. This was not a carefully planned uprising. It was spontaneous, a natural reaction from people who could not endure one more day. But the crowds grew. Workers left their machines and joined the march. Shouts echoed through the streets. Slogans spread like fire. Bread! Peace! Down with the regime! Police tried to break the demonstrations, but you cannot intimidate people who are hungry. You can only make them angrier. Over the next days, strikes widened. Tens of thousands, then hundreds of thousands poured into the streets. Petrograd became a pressure cooker, and the lid began to lift. The authorities answered with force. Troops were ordered out, warning shots, then live fire. And here the crucial question appeared. Who would the soldiers shoot? The enemy in the streets, or the people who looked like their own families? Part 3. The turning point. When soldiers switch sides. In revolutions, the decisive moment is rarely a slogan. It is the loyalty of the armed forces. Petrograd held many garrison units. These were reserves, new recruits, men already worn down by war. And many came from the same villages and factories as the protesters. When ordered to fire into the crowds, some soldiers did. People died. Blood darkened the snow. But with every shot, control slipped further away. Then small mutinies began inside barracks. Men argued. Men refused orders. Some shot their officers. Others opened armories. And once one unit broke, the domino effect started. The Petrograd garrison stopped acting like a single force. It fractured, and a growing part of it joined the demonstrators. This was the moment the monarchy lost its final lever. Because when you can no longer rely on soldiers to enforce your will, you have almost nothing left. Part 4. The Duma, the Soviets, and dual power. In the chaos, new centers of authority formed. On one side stood the Duma, Russia's parliament. Its powers had always been limited, but it brought together liberal and moderate politicians. On the other side were the Soviets, councils of workers and soldiers delegates. Most important was the Petrograd Soviet, where the raw energy of the streets began to organize itself into political power. And something unusual happened. Both forces existed at the same time. Both claimed to represent Russia, and for several days, no one could say with certainty who truly ruled. This situation became known as dual power. One side held formal legitimacy, the other held the practical influence of crowds, factories, and barracks. Duma leaders understood a simple truth. If they did nothing, Russia might slide into total anarchy, or worse, into civil war immediately. They formed a provisional committee to maintain order and to search for a political solution. But every path ran into the same obstacle. As long as the Tsar remained on the throne, no settlement would be accepted. Part 5. The Tsar on a train. Power slips away. While Petrograd boiled, where was Nicholas II? He was near the front, far from the breadlines, far from the chanting crowds, far from the reality of a capital turning against him. Messages arrived in waves, from ministers, from generals, from men who had served him for years, and their words grew sharper. Your Majesty, the situation is out of control. Nicholas tried to return to Petrograd by train, but rail lines were blocked. Key junctions were in rebel hands. The train was rerouted, and in that confusion, authority drained away hour by hour. The bitter truth was this: even when the Tsar issued commands, they were no longer carried out with certainty. The state was no longer a machine. It had become scattered pieces. The generals, who still held real military power, began to consider the unthinkable. Should the Tsar abdicate to save the country? And that advice became pressure, not from enemies, but from within the regime itself. Part 6. Abdication. The end of a dynasty. On March 2nd by the old calendar, March 15th by the modern calendar, Nicholas II signed the Act of Abdication. Just ink on paper. But it ended the Romanov dynasty's rule and the old model of absolute monarchy in Russia. There was no immediate scene of the palace in flames, no new king crowned the next morning, only a vast vacuum of power opening in front of an entire nation. A provisional government was formed. It promised a new Russia, built on law, rights, and representative rule. But from the first hour, the provisional government faced a near impossible problem. How do you govern when real authority is also shared with the Soviets? And how do you persuade the public when bread is still scarce and the war still continues? Part 7. Why February Saded. The February Revolution was not a secret coup. It was a social explosion, triggered by pressures that had been building for years. First, war. It consumed lives and resources. It made suffering feel normal. And when suffering becomes normal, endurance still has a limit. Second, food shortages and logistical collapse. Russia produced grain, but transport and distribution failed. Railways prioritized the military. Networks clogged, and city residents paid the price. Third, a crisis of trust. The court appeared detached. Decisions looked incompetent. Scandals and rumors multiplied. The Tsar was no longer seen as a father of the nation, but as a leader who could not fix anything. Fourth, and most decisive, the breakdown of loyalty in the Petrograd garrison. When soldiers no longer believed they were defending the country, and believed instead they were shooting their own people, the regime lost its foundation. February succeeded because it was not only a workers' strike. It became a citywide uprising. Women, workers, students, soldiers, and finally, insiders who realized the old order could not survive. Part 8. February was not the end. But February was only the opening chapter. It destroyed the old regime without solving the problems that created the crisis. People wanted peace. The provisional government hesitated. It feared leaving the war would weaken Russia. It feared losing credibility with allies, and it feared chaos. Peasants wanted land, but land reform was postponed. Leaders insisted on waiting for an elected constituent assembly. They wanted procedure, while the countryside wanted action. Workers wanted food and dignity, but the economy kept falling. Inflation kept rising, and anger kept building. In that vacuum, political forces competed hard. Simple promises became powerful, and power continued to drift toward the streets. That is why, when people say the Russian Revolution of 1917, remember, February toppled the old throne, but October would decide who controlled the new order. Ending. The days that shook the world. The February Revolution of 1917 is a cold lesson in history. A regime can look permanent, but if it loses public trust, fails to provide basic necessities, and loses the loyalty of its armed forces, it can fall very fast. In just a few days in Petrograd, from bread lines to strikes to riots to soldiers mutinying, history changed course. The Tsar abdicated. An empire entered uncertainty, and the world, from that moment on, would never be the same. If you want, in the next part, we can continue why the provisional government failed and how October 1917 pushed Russia into a completely new era.